This morning, we want to talk about faith that breaks through. And we're in Matthew chapter 9, verses 18 through 26, and Mark chapter 5, verses 21 to 43, which we've already looked at. When we think about life can be funny sometimes, right? Because we love our routines. We love our schedules, and we love to plan everything down to the last detail. And we have our lists, we have our calendars, and our reminders, right? And nowadays we have phones or watches that keep reminding us of all these things. We've got everything perfectly lined up, haven't we? But have you ever noticed that life rarely follows our plans? Right? We can make all the plans we want, but life rarely follows those. Life has a way of surprising us, often when we least expect it, right? And if you've ever tried to get a family out the door on time, you know what I'm talking about, right? You've got everything ready to go. You're all packed. Everyone is dressed, and you've managed to find both matching shoes for each child, which is a miracle in itself, right? But just as you grab the door handle, you're about to walk out the door, you hear a small voice from behind you saying, "I need to go to the bathroom," right? And just like that, all your plans go out the window. And life is full of those unexpected moments, interruptions, delays, and detours that seem to get in the way of our carefully laid out plans. Sometimes they're small and funny, like a child's sudden bathroom emergency. But other times, they're much bigger and much more difficult. A health crisis, an unexpected job loss, a broken relationship, moments that bring our world to a screeching halt. And so in today's passages, we see a story that is filled with interruptions. Jesus is going about his ministry. He's teaching and healing people, and then suddenly there's a crisis. A synagogue leader named Jairus comes to him, desperate because his daughter is dying. And Jesus sets off to help him, but on the way, there's yet another interruption. A woman who has been suffering for 12 years reaches out to him seeking healing. And it's a story that's full of unexpected twists and turns, but what's amazing is how Jesus handles it all. He doesn't get flustered. He doesn't tell Jairus, "Hey, sorry, I'm too busy," or, "Hey, Jairus, don't you see that I'm talking to some people right now?" He doesn't ignore the woman because he has somewhere important to be. Instead, Jesus meets each need with compassion, grace, and power. He turns life's interruptions into opportunities for faith and transformation. And so today, as we look at this passage, I want us to consider what it means to have a faith that breaks through. A faith that won't be stopped by fear, by delays, or social norms. We'll look at the story of Jairus, who's this desperate father, and the story of a woman who wouldn't let anything stop her from reaching Jesus. And as we do this, we'll discover that Jesus is ready and willing to meet us, even in the midst of our interruptions and unexpected moments. So let's look at this story together and see how we can develop a faith that seeks Jesus no matter what. Faith that isn't afraid to reach out, even when the situation seems impossible. So the first point we want to talk about is faith that seeks Jesus in desperation. Faith that seeks Jesus in desperation. And we'll start off by looking at Jairus. Jairus here is not just any man in the crowd. He's a synagogue leader. What that means is that at that time, being a synagogue leader meant that he had authority, respect, and influence. He was a man who knew the scriptures. He led people in worship, and he likely helped make decisions for the community. He was used to being the one person that, or the one that people came to for help. He was used to having things in order, to being in control. But now his world is falling apart. His daughter is dying. So this morning I want you to picture Jairus. Imagine the desperation that he must have felt. He's probably tried everything already by this point, right? He's brought in doctors, he's brought in healers, anything that he could, and anyone that he could think of to help his little girl. But nothing has worked. All of his power and influence can't save his daughter. He's a man who is used to being in control, but this situation that he's in is completely out of his hands. So in his desperation, Jairus makes a decision that might have shocked those around him. He goes to Jesus. I said this might have shocked those around him because Jesus wasn't exactly popular among the religious leaders at this time. Some of them were already suspicious of Jesus. They were questioning his teachings and his authority. But Jairus, he doesn't care about any of that. See, he's desperate, and he knows that Jesus is his only hope. He comes to Jesus and he falls at Jesus' feet. And this is a powerful moment. Because imagine, here's a respectable leader kneeling in the dust in front of a crowd begging for help. See, pride goes out the window when you're desperate. Jairus pleads with Jesus and says in Matthew 9:18, he says, "My daughter has just died, but come and put your hand on her and she will live." Notice the faith in Jairus' words. He doesn't say, maybe you can help her. He says, come and she will live. See, Jairus has faith that Jesus can do the impossible. That even though his daughter has died, Jesus has the power to bring her back to life. There's something here that's important for us to learn. And that is that desperation can often lead us to Jesus. It's when we come to the end of our abilities, to the end of our own strength, that we finally realize how much we need Jesus. Sometimes we think that we can handle things on our own. We try to fix our problems. We try to control our circumstances and solve everything with our own efforts. But there are moments in life where we realize that we just cannot do it. And in those moments, we have a choice. We can give in to despair, or we can do what Jairus did, and we can run to Jesus. Psalm 34, verse 17 to 18 says, "The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears them. He delivers them from all their troubles. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Jairus was brokenhearted. He was crushed in spirit, and in his desperation, he cried out to Jesus. And what did Jesus do? Jesus responded. He got up and he went with Jairus. Jesus didn't turn him away. Jesus didn't say to Jairus, Jairus, I'm sorry, I'm too busy. Or no, you're too late. Your daughter's already dead. He went with him. And it's important to note here that Jairus had to overcome both fear and pride to come to Jesus. He had to set aside his fear of what others might think. He had to set aside his pride as a leader, as a man who was supposed to have it all together. See, desperation often strips away our pride and our fear, and it brings us to a place where we are willing to do whatever it takes to get to Jesus. And isn't that the kind of faith that Jesus calls us to have? A faith that isn't held back by pride or fear. A faith that says, I need you, Jesus, and I'm willing to humble myself before you. Because James chapter 4, verse 10 tells us, it says, humble yourselves before the Lord and he will lift you up. See, Jairus' humility and desperation led him to Jesus, and Jesus responded. Jairus' story also teaches us that faith is often born when we run out of options. Have you ever been in a situation like that? Where you've tried everything and nothing works. Maybe it was a health crisis. You saw all the doctors and you tried all the treatments, but nothing seemed to change. Maybe it's a relationship that's broken, and no matter how hard you try, you cannot fix it. Maybe it's a financial struggle, and you're at the end of your rope. And in those moments, we often realize that we need something that's greater than ourselves. Jairus' story reminds us that it's okay to come to Jesus when we're desperate. It's okay to come to him when we've run out of options. In fact, that's exactly what he wants us to do. He wants us to come to him, to lay our burdens at his feet and to trust him to do what only he can do. So we see Jesus here. He responds to Jairus and he sets out to go to Jairus' house. He's on his way to Jairus' house and something incredible happens. We're introduced to another person who's in need. And this time it's an unnamed woman. And this woman has been suffering for 12 years from a condition that causes her to bleed continuously. Now, to understand her situation fully, we need to realize what this meant for her in that culture. See, because of her condition, she would have been considered ceremonially unclean, which meant that she was isolated from her community, much like the people with leprosy were. Right? She was unable to participate in worship, and she was likely shunned by those who were around her. For 12 years, she lived in the shadows, physically suffering and emotionally alone. And sometimes we read that story and then we just pass through it and we don't realize the implication of this. But let's think about that for a moment. 12 years is a long time, right? Think about where you were 12 years ago. For me, 12 years ago, I was still in Zimbabwe. We were running away from the government, making plans to skip the country. 12 years ago. So think about where you were 12 years ago. Imagine dealing with constant pain, with isolation and rejection for that entire period from that time till now. Imagine spending all your money on doctors who couldn't help, facing disappointment after disappointment. This woman was desperate. But like Jairus, she didn't let her desperation drive her to despair. She let it drive her to Jesus. This woman had every reason to give up. She had been suffering for so long and nothing had worked. But she didn't give up. Instead, she took a risk. She heard about Jesus and she decided that she was going to get to him, no matter what it took. Right? The crowds around Jesus were enormous, pressing in on every side. And it must have been difficult for her to even get close to him. But she didn't let that stop her. She pushed through the crowd and she reached out to touch the edge of his cloak. In Mark's account of the story, we're told that she thought to herself, if I only touch his clothes, I will be healed. And that's powerful, isn't it? I mean, she didn't need Jesus to speak to her. She didn't need Jesus to lay hands on her or to do anything special. She believed that just a touch would be enough. That's how strong her faith was. And this woman's story reminds us of an important lesson about faith that we talked about last week. The fact that faith requires action. It wasn't enough for her to believe that Jesus could heal her. She had to act on that belief. She had to take a step, push through the obstacles and reach out to Jesus. James chapter 2 verse 17, as we looked at last week, reminded us that faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. See, true faith moves us to action. Think about the obstacles that this woman had to face. There was a crowd, right? People who probably pushed her back, who didn't want her near them because of her condition. There was the fear. What if Jesus rejected her? What if nothing happened? But she didn't let those obstacles stop her. She pushed through the crowd. She overcame her fear and she reached out in faith. And how often do we let obstacles stop us from reaching out to Jesus? Maybe it's fear, right? Fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of what others might think. Maybe it's the crowd, people around us who discourage us, who tell us that it's not worth it. And maybe it's our own doubts, right? Wondering if Jesus really cares about our situation. This woman's story challenges us to push through those obstacles, to take a step of faith and to reach out to Jesus no matter what stands in our way. This woman was willing to risk everything to reach Jesus. And by stepping into that crowd, she took a huge risk. She wasn't supposed to be there. Her condition made her unclean, and anyone who touched her would also be considered unclean. She risked the scorn of the crowd, the possibility of being publicly humiliated. But she was willing to take that risk because she believed that Jesus could change her life. And this is the kind of faith that pleases God, a faith that is willing to take risks. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 6 says, "And without faith it is impossible to please God. Because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. This woman earnestly sought Jesus, and she was rewarded for it. Her faith wasn't cautious. It wasn't safe. It was loud. It was bold. It was risky. And it was exactly what Jesus was looking for. So when this woman touches Jesus' cloak, something incredible happens. The text tells us that Jesus stops. So Jesus has been walking through the crowd. Everybody's just bumping in and out. And Jesus stops and he turns around and he asks, "Who touched me?" His disciples are baffled by this question because they say, "Jesus, everybody's bumping into you. How can you even say who touched me?" Right? But Jesus knew that this was different. That this wasn't just a casual touch. That it was a touch of faith. And Jesus wanted to acknowledge that. And then he keeps asking, "Who touched me?" And then the woman comes forward and she's trembling and she falls at his feet and she tells Jesus everything. She tells him about her suffering, her desperation, and her hope that just by touching his cloak, that would heal her. And then Jesus looks at her and says to her, "Daughter, take heart. Your faith has healed you." And in that moment, not only is her body healed, but her heart is healed too. Jesus calls her daughter. It's a term of love and acceptance. After years of being rejected and isolated, she's seen, she's known, and she's loved by Jesus. Now remember, while this is going on, Jesus was on his way to help Jairus' daughter. And that was a critical situation in of itself, yet he stopped for this woman. He didn't see her as an interruption. He saw her as a person in need. And sometimes we may feel like we're not important enough for Jesus to take notice of us. We may think that he's too busy, that our problems are not significant enough. But Jesus is never too busy for us. He always has time for those who come to him in faith. Matthew 11, verse 28 says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." See, Jesus invites us to come to him, no matter what we're facing, no matter how insignificant we feel. He stops, he listens, and he responds to our faith. Then number 3, let's talk about faith that overcomes delay and doubt. See, while Jesus is still speaking to the woman, another interruption happens, right? News arrives that Jairus' daughter has died, and the messengers say in Mark 5:35, they say, "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" Can you imagine Jairus' heart sinking in that moment? He had come to Jesus with hope, right? He had stepped out in faith, and now it seemed like it was all for nothing. His worst fears had come true. His daughter was gone. Think about how Jairus must have felt. Jesus was coming with him, right? There was this glimmer of hope, but then there was a delay. And in that delay, everything seemed to fall apart. Maybe Jairus was thinking, "Man, if only we hadn't stopped. If only Jesus had come sooner, maybe my daughter would still be alive." But before Jairus could even react, Jesus looks at him and says, "Don't be afraid, just believe." What powerful words. Jesus doesn't deny the reality of the situation. Yes, the girl is dead. But he calls Jairus to something greater, which is faith over fear. Jesus is essentially saying, listen, trust me, even in the face of the worst news. Trust me, even when it seems hopeless. But you know what? One of the hardest things about faith is dealing with delays. That's one of the hardest things about faith, is dealing with delays. We live in a culture that values instant gratification. We want things to happen quickly, and we want answers now. But often, God works on a different timeline. Sometimes there are delays, and those delays can test our faith. We can begin to wonder if God is really listening, if he really cares, or if he's even able to help us. Jairus' story teaches us that just because there is a delay, it doesn't mean that God has forgotten us. It doesn't mean that our situation is beyond hope. Isaiah 55, verses 8 to 9. In Isaiah 55, 8 to 9, God says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, neither are your ways my ways. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts your thoughts." See, God's timing is different from ours, but his timing is perfect. Jesus was not too late for Jairus' daughter. The delay wasn't a denial. But notice the voices that come into the story at this point. The messengers say to Jairus, "Jairus, why bother the teacher anymore?" They're essentially saying, "Jairus, it's over. There's no point. There's nothing that can be done. So leave Jesus alone." These voices are filled with doubt and hopelessness. And we all face voices like that at times. Voices that tell us to give up. Voices that tell us that there's no point in praying, that there's no point in trusting God. These voices may come from others, sure, but sometimes they come from within ourselves. They come in our own moments of fear and doubt. But in that moment, Jesus speaks directly to Jairus, and he speaks directly to us when he says, "Don't be afraid, just believe." Jesus calls us to silence those voices of doubt, to push past the fear, and to keep trusting him, even when everything around us seems to say otherwise. In Proverbs 3, 5 to 6, we're reminded to trust in the Lord with all your heart and to lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. See, faith isn't about understanding everything. It's about trusting the one who does. So, after encouraging Jairus to believe, Jesus continues on to his house. And when they arrive at his house, they're met with a scene of mourning and chaos. There are people that are crying, wailing loudly because the girl has died. And as we read that, that might sound strange in our context, but in that culture, professional mourners were often hired to help express the grief of the family. So the atmosphere would have been loud, emotional, and overwhelming. But Jesus steps into the scene and he says something shocking. He says in Matthew 9:24, "The girl is not dead, but asleep." And the crowd laughs at him. They hear this and they laugh at him because they know what death looks like. They know that this girl is gone. But Jesus sees something that they don't see. He knows that death doesn't have to be the final word, doesn't have the final word. And he calls us to have that same perspective. He wants us to see our circumstances not through the lens of hopelessness, but through the lens of his power and promise. Jairus had to have faith to keep going. Right? The messengers come to him and tell him that, "Hey, your daughter's dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore." But he had to have faith to keep going, even in the face of death, even when others were laughing, and even when everything seemed lost. He had to trust Jesus enough to bring him into his house, into the very place of his pain and loss. And that's what Jesus asks of us too. He asks us to invite him into those places in our lives that feel hopeless, those places that seem dead, and to trust him to bring new life to those places. Ephesians 3:20 reminds us and says, "Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us." Jesus is able to do more than we can imagine, even in the face of what seems impossible. Jairus had to trust that Jesus could do something that no one else could: bring his daughter back to life. And that's exactly what Jesus did. So this morning I want to ask you, what areas in your life have you faced delay? What areas of your life have you been facing delay? What areas in your life have you prayed and hoped but things haven't changed? Where you've heard those voices say, "Why bother?" Well, Jesus' words to Jairus are his words to us today. Don't be afraid, just believe. He calls us to trust him, even when we don't understand. Even when the delay seems endless, even when others doubt, Jesus is with us just as he was with Jairus. He walks with us through the delay, through the doubt, through the fear, and he brings hope where there seems to be none. Our job is to keep believing, to keep trusting, to keep inviting Jesus into our situations, knowing that he has the power to do what we cannot. And finally, as we come to the final part of this incredible story, Jesus comes and is made it to Jairus' house and is confronted by the mourners who are weeping and wailing. It's a scene of heartbreak. It's filled with people who are certain that this is the end for Jairus' daughter. They've accepted death as the final word. But Jesus steps into that scene and he changes everything. See, when Jesus tells the crowd that the girl is not dead but asleep, their reaction is to laugh at him. They laugh because they think they know the finality of death. To them, Jesus' words seem ridiculous. How can he say she's only sleeping when they know that she's dead? But Jesus is revealing a profound truth here, that death is not the end when he is involved. For Jesus, death is like sleep. It's something temporary, something that can be overcome. And this is a powerful reminder that what seems impossible to us is not impossible for Jesus. Where we see an end, Jesus sees an opportunity for a new beginning. John chapter 11, verses 25 and 26 captures this beautifully, where Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. See, Jesus has authority over life and death. And in his presence, even the most hopeless situations can be turned around. Jesus goes into the room where the little girl lies and he takes her by the hand and he simply says, little girl, get up. And immediately the girl gets up and begins to walk around. Can you imagine the joy and the amazement of her parents in that moment? They had come to Jesus in desperation. They had faced delays and doubts, but now they were witnessing a miracle. Their daughter, who had been dead, was alive again. See, Jesus' authority over death is a central theme in the story. He doesn't use elaborate rituals or grand displays. He simply speaks and life returns. And this is the same authority that spoke the universe into existence. This is the same authority that calms storms. And it's the same authority that one day will call all of us out of our graves. Revelation chapter 1 verse 18 says, I am the living one. I was dead and now look, I am alive forever and ever. And I hold the keys of death and Hades. Jesus holds the keys to life and death. And there is nothing beyond his power. So as we reflect on this story, let's ask ourselves, where do we need Jesus to bring new life? Where in our lives do we need Jesus to bring new life? What are the areas in our lives that feel dead, hopeless, and beyond repair? Let's bring those to Jesus today, trusting that he has the power to bring resurrection. Let's trust him to take us by the hand, to walk with us, and to speak life into our darkest moments. Because Jesus is still in the business of raising the dead. He's still in the business of bringing hope where there is none. And he's calling us today to trust him, to believe in his power, and to experience the new life that only he can give. Maybe you're here today and you need to reach out to Jesus for the first time. Or maybe you need to reach out again after a long time of struggling on your own. Jesus is waiting. He's always ready to receive you, to respond to your faith, and to speak words of life and healing over you. Maybe you're facing a situation that seems impossible, where the delay has caused you to lose hope. Remember Jesus' words. Don't be afraid, just believe. Choose today to trust him, even when it doesn't make sense, even when it seems like it's too late. Because Jesus is faithful, and he will walk with you through every storm, through every doubt, through every delay. And let's also remember that these stories are not just about us as individuals, but they're for us as a church as well. Because as a church, we're called to be a community that lives by faith, that supports each other, that brings our needs and struggles to Jesus together. So let's be a church where people feel safe to reach out, where we encourage one another to keep believing, and where we invite Jesus into every part of our lives and our community. Imagine what could happen if we lived that kind of faith. A faith that reaches out. A faith that refuses to give up. A faith that trusts in Jesus as the resurrection and the life. Imagine the lives that could be changed. The hope that can be restored. The miracles that could happen in our midst. Because Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The same Jesus who healed that bleeding woman and raised Jairus' daughter is here today. He's ready to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine. So as we close, I want to give you an opportunity to respond. If you're in need of a touch from Jesus today, whether it's physical healing, whether it's emotional healing, or hope in a situation that seems hopeless, I want to encourage you to reach out to him. Don't let fear or doubt hold you back. Jesus is here, and he's ready to meet you at your point of need. And for those of us who have been waiting, who have experienced delays, who have heard the voices of doubt, let's choose today to trust Jesus again. Let's surrender our fears and our timelines to him. And let's believe that he is able to do what seems impossible. Amen.